Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day I almost gave up, standing at the airport with a one-way ticket. Have you ever stood in a crowded place and felt completely invisible? Like you could scream at the top of your lungs and no one would even blink? That was me, 3 years ago, at Boston Logan International Airport, holding a one-way ticket back to a country I hadn't called home in a decade. My hands were shaking. Not from cold, but from the sheer weight of failure pressing down on my chest like a 1,000-pound stone. I had come to America with dreams so big they could have filled the entire sky. But that morning, standing in that terminal surrounded by families hugging each other goodbye and lovers kissing like they had all the time in the world, I felt nothing but emptiness. I had spent years trying to learn English, trying to sound American, trying to erase every trace of my accent so people would stop looking at me like I was a stranger in my own life. I memorized vocabulary lists until my brain felt like it would explode. I watched grammar videos until my eyes burned. I practiced pronunciation in front of the mirror until my tongue felt like a foreign object in my own mouth. But none of it worked. I still got the confused looks. I still got the slow, patronizing speech from waiters and cashiers. I still got asked, "Where are you really from?" As if my answer would never be enough. And then my marriage fell apart. He said it wasn't about my English. But how could I believe that? How could I believe anything when every single day felt like a battle I was destined to lose? So there I was, ready to give up, ready to walk away from this American dream that had turned into a nightmare. I was about to board that plane, about to leave everything behind, when a voice cut through the noise of the airport. A voice that stopped me in my tracks. A voice that asked me a simple question I had never been asked before. Not "Where are you from?" Not "Why is your English so broken?" But something else entirely. Something that made me freeze, made me turn around, made me miss my flight. And that decision, that one moment of hesitation, changed absolutely everything. You'll have to wait until the next part to find out what that voice said, because that question is the reason I'm still here, still standing. Still telling you this story today. My American dream turned nightmare, when loneliness became my only friend. Picture this, you're surrounded by millions of people, yet you've never felt more alone in your entire life. That was my reality for 2 solid years in America. I had imagined this country would be a place where dreams came true, where hard work paid off, where I would finally find belonging. But instead, I found myself drowning in a sea of faces that looked through me like I was invisible. Every morning, I would wake up in my tiny apartment, stare at the ceiling, and ask myself the same question, what am I doing here? The answer never came. My job at a small coffee shop was okay, but every customer interaction felt like an exam I was destined to fail. "Can I get a latte with oat milk?" the customer would say. And I would freeze. My brain would scramble for the words, but they would get stuck somewhere between my mind and my mouth. I'd respond with something like, "Latte, oat milk, yes?" And they would smile that pity smile, the one that says, "Poor thing, she's trying so hard." That smile haunted me. It followed me home, sat with me during dinner, whispered to me in the middle of the night. I started avoiding conversations entirely. I would nod, smile, and say nothing. Because saying nothing was safer than saying something wrong. I thought if I just studied harder, practiced longer, memorized more vocabulary, the problem would solve itself. So I bought every English learning book I could find. I watched YouTube videos until 3 a.m. I recorded myself speaking and played it back, cringing at every mispronounced word. But the more I studied, the worse I felt. Because no matter how many words I learned, I still sounded like the foreigner. I still didn't belong. And then came the breaking point, the moment that shattered whatever hope I had left. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had just finished a particularly brutal shift where a customer had complained about my accent. I came home, sat on my kitchen floor, and cried until I had no tears left. I looked around my empty apartment and realized I had no one. No family here. No real friends. Just a collection of books and a broken dream. That's when I made the decision to leave. I booked a one-way flight back to my home country, packed my bags, and said goodbye to the American dream that had become a nightmare. But you already know I didn't get on that plane, right? Something happened at the airport that I never expected, something that would introduce me to a family who would change absolutely everything about how I saw America, myself, and the real meaning of learning a language. A stranger's kindness on the worst day, the voice that changed everything. Let me paint you a picture of the most miserable moment of my life. I was standing in line at Logan Airport, holding that one-way ticket like it was a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. The fluorescent lights were buzzing overhead, giving everything that sickly green tint that makes airports feel like waiting rooms for the afterlife. My eyes were swollen from crying. My hands were still shaking. I had already texted my sister back home, telling her I was coming, that I had failed. That the American dream was a lie they sold to desperate people like me. And then I heard it. A small voice, from somewhere behind me. Not loud. Not demanding. Just a simple question that cut through all the noise like a knife through butter. Are you okay? I turned around, expecting to see a TSA agent or an airport employee asking if I needed help. But instead, I saw a little girl. Maybe 7 or 8 years old, with messy pigtails and the kind of curious eyes that haven't learned to judge yet. She was holding her mother's hand, looking up at me with genuine concern. You look sad, she said. Are you going on a trip? Her mother, a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, gently tugged her daughter's hand and said, Sweetie, don't bother the lady. But I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I was so used to people looking through me, ignoring me, treating me like I was invisible or inconvenient. This little girl, this tiny human who didn't know me from anyone, had seen me. Actually seen me. And she had asked if I was okay. In that moment, the tears I thought I had run out of came flooding back. I crouched down to her level, my voice barely a whisper, and I said, I don't know. I think I made a mistake. Her mother knelt beside me and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes the best mistakes lead us exactly where we're supposed to be. She invited me to sit with them at their gate. They weren't going anywhere fancy, just flying to Chicago to visit family. But for the next 45 minutes, that family treated me like I was part of their group. They didn't ask where I was from. They didn't ask why my English was broken. They just talked to me about their dog, about the little girl's favorite cartoon, about the best pizza in Chicago. And for the first time in years, I spoke English without feeling like I was being tested. I spoke English and felt like a human being. When my flight was called, I stood up, ready to walk away from this country forever. But then the little girl grabbed my hand and said, "Please don't go. Stay. I want to teach you more words." And something inside me cracked open, something I had locked away so tightly I had forgotten it existed. What did I do next? You'll find out in the next part, because that little girl's question saved me in a way I never expected. The family that saw me differently, not as a foreigner, but as a person. Can you imagine being looked at for the first time in years, truly looked at, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worth knowing? That's exactly what happened when I missed my flight. Yes, I missed it. On purpose. Because when that little girl grabbed my hand and asked me to stay, something in my heart shifted. I looked at her mother, Sarah, and I said, I think I want to stay. I don't know how, but I want to try." Sarah smiled the warmest smile I had ever seen and said, "Then come home with us. We're not going to Chicago anymore. We're going back to our house in the suburbs. You're coming with us." And just like that, I walked out of that airport with a family I had met 45 minutes ago. I know how crazy that sounds. I was a stranger, a complete stranger, and they were inviting me into their home. But that's the thing about desperation, when you have nothing left, trust becomes the only thing you can afford to give. Their house was a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, with a garden full of flowers I couldn't name and a golden retriever who greeted me like I was his long-lost best friend. That dog, Charlie, was the first being in America who didn't care about my accent, my mistakes, or where I was from. He just wanted to be loved, and he gave love freely in return. I wish humans were that simple. The family consisted of Sarah, her husband David, and their daughter Lily, the little girl from the airport. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, but to me, they were the most extraordinary humans I had ever met. That first night, Sarah cooked spaghetti, the kind of simple American meal I had seen in movies but never actually eaten. We sat around their kitchen table, and nobody asked me to speak perfect English. Nobody corrected my pronunciation. Nobody looked at me with pity when I mixed up my words. They just listened. They listened like what I had to say was important. That night, I learned something my years of studying English had never taught me, that language isn't just words, it's connection. It's sitting at a table with people who care about you, and knowing that even if you say it wrong, they still want to hear you. For the first time in years, I fell asleep without feeling like a failure. I fell asleep feeling like maybe, just maybe, I could belong somewhere. But the real test came the next morning when I had to face a question I had been running from my entire life, a question that would force me to confront everything I believed about myself and my ability to ever speak English without shame. Learning English at the dinner table, the real classroom nobody told me about. What if I told you that the best English lesson I ever had didn't come from a textbook, a video, or a classroom, but from a 6-year-old girl with pigtails and a golden retriever who couldn't speak a word? The morning after I arrived at Sarah's house, I woke up to the smell of pancakes and the sound of Lily giggling. I walked into the kitchen, still half asleep, and Lily looked up at me with those curious eyes and said, "Good morning. Do you want to help me make breakfast?" I froze. My brain instantly went into panic mode. What if I said something wrong? What if I didn't understand her? But then I remembered something, the way they had listened to me at the airport, without judgment, without impatience. So instead of running away, I said, "Yes. I help you. Please." And for the next hour, Lily and I made pancakes together. She would point at things and say the words, flour, milk, egg, spatula. I would repeat after her, slowly, carefully. And she would nod and say, "Good job," just like a proud little teacher. She didn't correct my pronunciation harshly. She didn't make me feel stupid for messing up. She just kept going, kept including me, kept making me feel like I was part of something. That's when I realized the biggest mistake I had been making all these years. I had been treating English like it was a test, something to pass, something to get right. But it's not. Language is a game, a dance, a way of connecting. You don't need to be perfect to be understood. You just need to be present. Sarah and David would tell stories at dinner about their day, and I would listen. Not just to the words, but to the rhythm, the emotion, the laughter. I started noticing that native speakers don't speak perfectly either. They stumble. They pause. They say the wrong word and laugh about it. The difference was, they didn't beat themselves up for it. They just kept going. I started doing that too. I would say something wrong, and instead of apologizing profusely, I would just laugh and say, "Sorry, I am still learning." And they would say, "Don't be sorry. We love hearing your stories." That acceptance, that unconditional warmth, it did something to me that no amount of vocabulary memorization ever could. It made me feel safe to speak. It made me feel like my accent wasn't a flaw, but a part of my story. I was learning English without even trying, just by existing in this family's orbit. But then came the night when Sarah asked me a question that made me confront something I had been avoiding my whole life. A question about my past, my homeland, and what I had left behind. And my answer would change everything about how I saw myself. When I stopped trying to sound American, the freedom of being myself. What if I told you that the moment I finally started learning English was the moment I stopped trying to sound American? I know that sounds completely backward. For years, I was convinced that the only way to be accepted in this country was to erase every trace of my accent, to speak perfectly. To blend in so seamlessly that no one would ever ask me where I was from. I thought assimilation was the goal. I thought if I could just sound like them, I would finally belong. But sitting at Sarah's kitchen table, surrounded by a family who didn't care about my accent, I realized how wrong I was. It happened during dinner, about a week after I arrived. We were talking about our favorite foods, and I was trying to describe a dish my grandmother used to make, a traditional Vietnamese noodle soup called bun bò hue. I was struggling to find the words. I kept stumbling, correcting myself, apologizing for my pronunciation. And then Sarah said something that stopped me mid-sentence. She said, "Why do you keep apologizing? Your accent is beautiful. It's part of your story. Don't erase it." I stared at her, completely speechless. Beautiful? My accent? The thing I had been trying to hide, to fix, to eliminate my entire life? She looked at me with those kind eyes and said, "When you speak English with your accent, I can hear where you come from. I can hear your journey. Why would you want to hide that?" That was the moment everything shifted. I had been taught, by society, by media, by my own insecurities, that having an accent was a weakness. But Sarah was telling me it was a strength. It was proof that I was brave enough to learn a new language, to build a new life, to keep going even when everything felt impossible. I started paying attention to how Sarah and David spoke. They didn't use fancy vocabulary or perfect grammar. They used simple words, honest words, words that came from their hearts. And I realized that the most important thing in communication isn't being correct, it's being understood. And you can be understood with imperfect English. You can be understood with an accent. You can be understood with mistakes. Because when people want to understand you, they will. They'll lean in, they'll ask questions, they'll meet you halfway. The problem was never my English. The problem was that I had surrounded myself with people who weren't willing to meet me halfway. But here, with this family, I was finally meeting people who saw my accent not as a barrier, but as a bridge. That night, I made a decision. I would stop trying to sound American. I would stop apologizing for my mistakes. I would speak English in my own voice, with my own accent, and let the words come as they came. And something miraculous happened. The more I stopped caring about perfection, the better I actually got. My English became more natural, more fluent, more me. But the real test was yet to come. Because Sarah had noticed something about me, something I had been hiding even from myself. And what she was about to ask me would force me to confront the deepest fear I had ever carried. The gift of being seen, when I finally felt like I belonged. What if I told you that the thing I was most ashamed of, my accent, my mistakes, my foreignness, was actually the thing that made this family love me more? It sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what happened. The night Sarah asked me the question I had been running from my entire life, everything changed. She looked at me across the dinner table, her eyes soft but curious, and she said, "What do you miss most about home?" I froze. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I had spent so many years trying not to think about it. I had convinced myself that longing for home was a weakness, that missing my culture meant I wasn't trying hard enough to be American. But sitting there, with Lily playing with her food and Charlie the dog sleeping at my feet, I felt something crack open inside me. "I miss my grandmother's cooking," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I miss the sound of my language. I miss being understood without having to explain myself. And then the tears came, the kind of tears that have been building for years, trapped behind a wall of determination and denial. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't tell me to stop crying. She didn't say it's okay in that dismissive way people do when they don't know what else to say. She just held my hand and let me cry. And when I finally stopped, she said something I'll never forget: "You don't have to be American to belong here. You just have to be you. And we want to know the real you." All of her. Accent and all. In that moment, I realized what I had been missing my entire time in America. I had been so focused on fitting in that I had forgotten to be seen. I had been so obsessed with sounding like everyone else that I had stopped sounding like myself. But this family didn't want a fake American version of me. They wanted the real me, the one who missed her grandmother, who struggled with English, who had a beautiful accent that told the story of where she came from. Lily would sit with me after school and ask me to teach her words in my language. She would say, "How do you say I love you in Vietnamese?" And I would tell her, "on. She would repeat it over and over until she got it right, her little tongue stumbling over the tones. And when she finally said it perfectly, she would run to her parents and shout, "Look what I learned." Sarah and David would smile and say, "We have our own language teacher now." For the first time in years, I felt valued, not for how well I spoke English, but for who I was and what I could offer. I was no longer a burden, a problem to be fixed. I was a gift. And that feeling, that indescribable feeling of being seen and cherished for exactly who you are, it healed something in me that I didn't even know was broken. But the story doesn't end there. Because just when I thought I had found my place, something happened that tested everything I had rebuilt. Something that made me question whether I really belonged after all. Teaching them Vietnamese, learning their love, when languages became a bridge. What if I told you that the best way to learn a language isn't studying it, it's teaching your own? That sounds crazy, right? But it's exactly what happened when I started teaching Lily Vietnamese. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and Lily was bored. She had finished her homework, watched her cartoons, and was now lying on the living room floor, dramatically announcing that she was dying of boredom. Sarah looked at me with a mischievous smile and said, "Why don't you teach her some Vietnamese? She's been asking for weeks." I hesitated. Teaching Vietnamese? My language? The one I had been trying so hard to hide? But Lily's eyes lit up like Christmas morning, and I couldn't say no. So we started with the basics. Hello is Xin Chào. Thank you is Come on. I love you is on. Lily repeated after me, her little tongue struggling with the tones, her face scrunched in concentration. And then she would run to her parents and shout, "Xin Chào, Mommy. Come on, Daddy." And Sarah and David would laugh and clap and say, "Our little Vietnamese superstar." Something magical happened during those lessons. As I taught Lily my language, I started to see it through her eyes, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something beautiful and valuable. She didn't care about my accent. She didn't care if my English wasn't perfect. She just wanted to learn, to connect, to share something with me. And in teaching her, I was teaching myself something I had never understood before, that my culture, my language, my story were gifts. Not burdens. Not obstacles. Gifts. David started joining our lessons too. He would sit at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down phrases in his messy handwriting, practicing the pronunciation like a diligent student. He would say things like, "I'm so bad at this," and I would laugh and say, "You sound just like me learning English." And we would both laugh at our mutual struggles, united in our imperfection. Those evenings became my favorite part of the day. The four of us, Sarah, David, Lily, and me, sitting around the table, mixing Vietnamese and English, laughing at our mistakes, celebrating our small victories. I was teaching them my language, but they were teaching me something far more important. They were teaching me that love doesn't need perfect grammar. It doesn't need flawless pronunciation. It just needs willingness. Willingness to try, to fail, to try again. Willingness to sit in the discomfort and keep going anyway. Willingness to say, "I don't understand, but I want to." That's what I had been missing all those years. I had been so focused on being understood that I had forgotten to be willing. Willing to be vulnerable. Willing to be imperfect. Willing to let people see the real me, accent and all. But just when I thought I had found my forever home, something happened that made me question everything again. Something that forced me to make the hardest decision of my life. A decision about whether to stay in America or finally go home. The day I canceled my flight, choosing to stay when everything said leave. What if I told you that the most important decision of my life happened not in a moment of clarity, but in a moment of complete chaos? It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after I had moved in with Sarah and David. I had finally gotten my life back together. I had a new job at a local bookstore, I was speaking English with more confidence, and I felt like I was part of something real. But then my phone rang. It was my sister calling from home, her voice trembling. "Mom is sick," she said. "She's asking for you. When are you coming back?" Those words hit me like a freight train. My mother, the woman who had raised me, who had cried when I left for America, who had never stopped praying for me. She was sick, and she was asking for me. Everything I had built, everything I had rebuilt, suddenly felt fragile and meaningless. I had a choice to make. Stay in America, in this new life I had created with this family who had saved me, or go back to my homeland, to my sick mother, to the life I had left behind. I was torn in two. Sarah found me crying in the backyard, my phone still in my hand. She sat down next to me, put her arm around my shoulders, and didn't say a word. She just let me cry. When I finally stopped, I told her everything. About my mother, about my guilt, about the impossible choice in front of me. She listened patiently, and then she said, "You know we'll support you no matter what you decide, right? You are family now. That doesn't change because you're on a different continent." But I still couldn't decide. So I did the only thing I knew to do, I wrote. I opened my journal, the one I had started writing in simple English, and I poured out everything. My fear of losing my mother. My fear of losing this new family. My fear of making the wrong choice. And as I wrote, I realized something. America was never the problem. My English was never the problem. The problem was that I had spent my whole life running away from myself. Running from my accent. Running from my culture. Running from the fear that I would never belong anywhere. But this family had taught me something I had never known, that belonging isn't about where you are, it's about who you're with. It's about finding people who see you, love you, and accept you exactly as you are. I made my decision that night. Not an easy decision, but the right one for me. I booked a flight to go see my mother, but I didn't buy a one-way ticket. I bought a round-trip ticket. Because I knew I was coming back. I was coming back to the family that had saved me, to the life I had built, to the person I had become. And when I told Sarah and David, they threw their arms around me and said, "We'll be here when you get back. This is your home now." The hardest part was yet to come. Saying goodbye to Lily, the little girl who had seen me at my worst and loved me anyway. But I knew that the goodbyes weren't forever. Because I had finally found my place, and no amount of distance could take that away. America is not a place, it's the people who changed everything. What if I told you that the place you've been running from your whole life might actually be the place you were meant to find? That's the paradox I finally understood after my trip back home. I flew to see my mother, held her hand, told her I loved her in our language, and she looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes and said something I'll never forget, "You belong there now. I can hear it in your voice." I was confused. "But Mama, I still speak English with an accent. I still make mistakes. I still feel like a foreigner sometimes." She smiled weakly and said, "The accent isn't what makes you belong. It's the love. You have love there. That's all that matters." I stayed with her for 2 weeks. I cooked her favorite meals, told her stories about Sarah and David and Lily, and she listened with the kind of patience that only mothers have. And when I left, she kissed my forehead and said, "Go home. Your family is waiting." That's when I realized, home was no longer the country I was born in. Home was the people who had seen me at my lowest and loved me anyway. Home was Sarah, who had held my hand when I cried. Home was David, who had practiced Vietnamese with me and never laughed at my mistakes. Home was Lily, the little girl who had asked me if I was okay at the airport and then wouldn't let me leave. When I returned to America, Sarah and David were waiting for me at the airport with a sign that said "Welcome home." Lily ran into my arms before I could even drop my bags, hugging me so tight I almost cried. Charlie the dog circled us, barking with excitement. I was no longer a stranger. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer desperately trying to become someone I wasn't. I was just me, accent, mistakes, and all. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. I continued living with them for another year, eventually getting my own apartment nearby, but we stayed family in every way that mattered. Lily still called me Auntie. I still had dinner at their house every Sunday. And I still taught them Vietnamese, even though Lily now knew more than I did. My English didn't become perfect. It never will. But I stopped caring about perfection and started caring about connection. I realized that the goal of learning a language isn't to erase your past, it's to build a future. And the future I built was better than anything I could have imagined. I now have a community. I have a purpose. I have a voice. And that voice, imperfect, accented, flawed, tells a story that matters. Not just to me, but to anyone who has ever felt like they didn't belong. So here's my advice to you. If you're watching this and feeling hopeless about your English, stop trying to sound like someone else. Start speaking like yourself. Your accent is not a weakness. Your mistakes are not failures. They are proof that you are brave enough to try. And somewhere out there, there's a family waiting to see you, to hear you, to love you exactly as you are. You just have to be willing to let them in. That's all for today. I'll make more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to see them.